Okay. So it's a really exciting moment now to move to the Amartya Sen Prize ceremony. Maybe first we should mention that Amartya Sen is planning to come, and he was extremely keen to come and extremely disappointed not to make it. And it's really from far too many conflicting engagements. But he was extremely keen to be here, so he's here with us in spirit, I guess. But instead, it's wonderful to invite Raymond Baker again to the podium, and he will be giving out the awards. Should I mention quickly who we have sitting here? So that, and I hope you can answer me. We have Nikolai Angela, who is from the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth. We have Paavo Tevenen, who is from the University of Helsinki, and we have Matti Hyönen from the University of Helsinki and the Aalto University. And I think you have something to say.
Let me first of all draw attention to what I presume you have noticed, the brochures over here talking about the book Global Tax Fairness. If you buy the book today, you get a 30% discount on it. So I think the authors probably did not want to make that pitch quite so bluntly, so I will do it on their behalf. We are indeed indebted to Amartya Sen for lending his name to this prize. He was with us last year, made an excellent address, had accepted to come here, but finally at the last moment recognized that his continuing classroom duties prevented him from coming. But he's a great supporter of this effort of helping people dig deeper into this subject matter of illicit money, tax fairness, which we are all addressing. The two awards this year are extremely interesting, and we had great fun in the evaluation group talking about these awards. First of all, the paper by Matti Hyönen and Paavo Tevenen on the politics of intra-firm trade. This really resonated with me in particular because my first lesson in Nigeria in the early 1960s was trying to understand why the head of a multinational corporation said to me, "I'm not trying to make a profit." I had just graduated from Harvard Business School. I spent 2 years studying all about how to make a profit. And here one of the early people that I talked to says, "I'm not trying to make a profit." I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. Well, what he was talking about was transfer pricing. Everything that he was purchasing from the parent company in the UK was priced at such a high level that all the profits he might have earned in Nigeria were going back to the UK. I finally understood the subject of transfer pricing, and it has fascinated me for 50 years how this continues. I have, over these years, never known a multinational, multi-billion-dollar, multi-product corporation that did not use abusive transfer pricing on some part of its product lines, sometimes to shift money across borders to the detriment of the countries out of which the money comes. I particularly liked your delving into the political questions that surround multinational corporations. Over the half century since I graduated from business school, I've watched corporations become increasingly political, to the point that now the economic efforts that they are undertaking are about on a par with their political efforts. So it's not just lobbying, it's their relationships to the governments, it's their relationships to democracy and human rights and so forth that are not in good shape. But corporations have become increasingly political animals, and I especially liked what you did there. Nikolai's article, paper that he wrote is looking at marginal corporate tax rates. This was extremely well done, taking a slice of the tax question and analyzing it in depth, and particularly do reductions in marginal corporate tax rates, what effect do they have on foreign direct investment and on GDP? Yes, if you reduce marginal corporate tax rates, you can attract foreign direct investment. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you are increasing gross domestic product. I have gone all over Africa, encouraging African countries not to offer tax incentives, particularly on resource investments. I've said all over Africa that you've got the resources. The West has no choice except to come here and invest in your resources. You don't have to give any tax incentives to do that. You've taken a slice of that question and developed it very, very well indeed. We're extremely pleased to give the award jointly to Matti and Teva, and individually to Nikolai, to tie this year for the 2 awards. Gentlemen, can I please present you with your checks, and let's have a round of applause. Wow. Let's have a picture.
All right.
A picture shaking hands with each other.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Okay.
All right. Thank you.
And the 2 of you together also, you know.
All right.
And the 2 of you.
All right.
Congratulations.
Wow.
Okay.
Just to
All right.
Yeah, hold it up, showing me a map. Okay.
Wow.
Matti and Teva, why don't you go first and give us an explanation of your paper in more detail, then we will follow with Nikolai.
Okay, thank you. Really wonderful to be here. This is an amazing moment. We're really honored, right? Proud and all that. And it's particularly great to be here at Yale at the Global Justice Program. Coming here, of course, we knew more about it. Matti's coming here for 1 year. And reading the papers, I realized more than before, like, you know, there's, apart from this sort of more financial things and like that, the excellent global political theory and the normative dimension of that. And I think in our paper we try to combine a little bit the more technical parts on transfer pricing and all of that with opening at least questions about normative political theory that we don't necessarily delve that deeply into. And I was particularly impressed, like when Raymond was talking at the beginning and said like how language is important. And in some sense, one of the implications of why we look at the politics of inter-firm trade and all that is to try to open the language in some of the academic discourses, like international political economy, which is kind of my field, where people often say, like, we want to go beyond the dichotomy between political and economic, and then you look at what people who claim to do it actually do. They study the interaction between the political and the economic, as if the political will always be derived from the state. And when they say, yeah, trade and commerce. Yes, you're right, they are political. Look, the trade, the state intervenes here and there. And what we try to say, and I think it resonates a little bit with your argument that if you look at the illicit financial flows, actually a big part is not because there's a state crook somewhere, but it's within commerce. And thereby we try to focus on the inherently political nature of the economy by looking at the inherently political nature of trade, which is not to be only seen as the result of state intervention. So in that sense, we want to challenge some of the assumptions in global political economy, international political economy, and also in the more sort of political debates and activism, a little bit perhaps inspired by when feminists said the personal is political. And that opened ways by politicizing patriarchal family to make reforms and rethink power relations within the family and legal changes and all that. So now if we are able to really make the claim that trade, commerce and capitalist economy are political, to what extent can we be inspired by the feminist struggles to make reforms and politicize capitalist economy? And I don't think even in international political economy, because of our language where we tend to think state versus market is the political versus economic thing, and that's why we want to politicize the economy. Something like that. There's much more technical stuff here, so why don't you tell them?
Yeah, what we are focusing on this article is the arm's length principle, and it has been mentioned here before today. And we wanted to look at the normative aspects of the arm's length principle. So for those of you who are not familiar with the term, arm's length principle is the key principle used in the intra-firm trade of corporations. So according to the arm's length principle, whenever a company trades with itself within the multinational company, it should use prices that are determined as if they were on arm's length basis. What we are pointing out in the article that even though there's much talk about arm's length principle and also its violations, it was already in 1960s and even before that the arm's length principle was acknowledged by the international community of not being the de facto norm. So already in the 1960s, the OECD and also at the courts in the US acknowledged that it's often impossible to determine the arm's length of prices. And because of that, already at that time, international community started to adopt other mechanisms for determining prices, cost plus model and so on, different kind of methods. So what we are saying in this article is basically that because of the prevalence of this non-market setting, we should, in a great extent of world trade, we should not analyze it as a market-based exchange, but rather as a conscious planning. And by making this decision to focus on the planning aspects of the multinational corporations, that opens up avenues for also for politicizing the companies, for creating more sort of a policy space for demands for unitary taxation or country-by-country reporting or whatever initiatives you want to promote. So that's basically, we also compare the arm's length principle to another body part metaphor that is the invisible hand of Adam Smith. And we draw the attention to that all these volumes of critical thinking and critical research on the invisible hand, and contrast that with the almost total absence of this critical normative research on the arm's length principle. So that's, I think, basically the idea of the article. You have probably something to add.
Well, maybe because often the critical research on the arm's length principle points out correctly, to a great extent, that it doesn't function. Okay, crises are made there. But we actually claim that it has another function where it does function. It has an ideological function. Because the mismatch between the market economy theory, assumptions of market, and the really existing capitalism and the planned nature, you need something like, or at least you can use something like the assumption of arm's length in order to sort of make this mismatch not become an strong ideological contradiction in justifications and legitimations of the current system, because in order to legitimate the system, the argument that it's really a free market system is very important, and thereby with a little bit like, analogously to some extent to the invisible hand, the arm's length principle plays this function, so it actually works in that other ideological sense. So,
And we call that the double role of the arm's length principle, as is in the title of our paper.
yeah.
So I think that's it basically.
Yeah, then there are all these more technical things on like the reform proposals and all that, so we can come back to that also in the discussion, but maybe we'll listen to Nikolai's presentations. Or do you want to, or should we open the,
My instinct should to go ahead with the second paper and open it up for questions on both of them. So,
Okay. Thank you. I go by Nick, so for a name like mine, I've decided that it's easier to shorten it. So, but I'm not going to get technical on my paper. If you would like to read it, I hope it gets published. And if it doesn't, I'll just send you a copy and I'll give you a fire. But I'll tell you why I'm doing the work that I'm doing. It's all based on my research on industrial recruitment. It's all based on my experience too. I grew up in the transitional years in Bulgaria when communism was ending, and it was part of a political family that was part of the reforms. So we had immigrant relatives come to Bulgaria and try to organize the opposition and bring with them Western knowledge, market liberalization, and policy implementation. So that didn't work out so well, you'll find out. Baby steps. But anyway, then after we said, oh, forget this, we're moving to America, I ended up in Clemson University doing my PhD in economic development. And being a big supporter or enthusiast about foreign direct investment, I learned that South Carolina was the #1 state in industrial recruitment, where more citizens were employed by foreign firms than anywhere else. They were the largest destination of foreign direct investment, and I started digging into it. Then also, what do I learn? That we have the highest persistent unemployment, we have the lowest education metrics in the United States, and we have this culture of spiraling down to the bottom of continuous recruitment based on incentives. So I went to talk to one of the consulting firms in Greenville, South Carolina, that was writing how they were brokering multi-million-dollar deals for Nissan to go to Tennessee, and they had grown into this conglomerate in the site selection industry. And after a little bit of schmoozing and the right people agreed to talk to me, I said, okay, so tell me why you have jobs. Why do you broker these humongous deals for those multinational corporations? Why can't they? Lawyers, why can't they do it themselves? They said, because we're the only ones who can negotiate with local government. Because we know local government officials, we understand their structures, we understand their political pressures, and we can tell them what incentives to provide. I said, great, so tell me, how do they base their decisions? Is it what we all think? Is it, no unions, low wages? And it's like, I'm like, oh, I know, taxes. I said, what do you mean, taxes? He goes, taxes are a weird thing. We can always write them off. I'm like, I don't understand that, but so tell me, why do you make money? What do you actually convince local governments to give to the companies for them to come here? Would anybody care to guess? They define them in a very nice term called recurring costs. What are recurring costs? Water, sewer, and electric. So on one side, you have taxes that they're willing to sacrifice as a base for raising their revenue, right? Because they're willing to write them off, give them tax breaks and tax incentives. On the other hand, they're also willing to undermine their tax base by the streams that really build their local revenue streams, which is recurrent costs, because those are subsidized local utility rates. So, for example, BMW is the biggest success of coming to South Carolina, expanding now their facilities with $1.9 billion. Is the largest R&D and manufacturing facility in North America. So, would you care to guess what their electric bill is? It's about $30 million a year. Would you like to not pay it for 5 years? Yeah. So this is what my work is based on, and then I understand that my people, political scientists, don't quite understand these economic incentives. So when the political debate was out about tax inversion and Walgreens leaving, and politicians started, beating the drum of making a statement of how, on one side, you're not lowering the corporate tax rate, so you're killing American competitiveness, the Republican rhetoric, so you're anti-business. And on the other side, it's American corporate greed, they're leaving the liberal side. So everybody was jumping on this whole concept of tax inversion ruining the world. And yes, I know it's a problem. So I started digging into, well, how can we model this tax inversion, which is what my paper is on. And I found out that it could be a problem, but as long as, and you guys understand this a lot better than me, as long as we have a system in formula accounting where you can write off debt as an operational expense, you can pretty much not pay any effective tax, right? So tax inversion, as much as I understand it, it's a huge problem, and I think it's a problem. I think with tax inversion goes hand in hand with incentive packages to be gained in the future. Willingness of going somewhere else. Yes, we're going to lower your tax rate, that's going to be a signal to get you here, but once you get here, we're also going to negotiate further on recurring costs, on breaks, and other incentives to keep you back. So that's where I went with my argument, and so we'll decide if it makes any difference or not. So, thank you.
Let's throw it open to your questions now and comments, please. We've got two really, really good papers, and I certainly think both of them will get published. And looking forward to doing that. But your own questions and comments, please.
Just to start quickly, it's interesting because during the BEPS process, they held some consultations for people interested in updates, and as time went on, Pascal Saint-Amans, who heads the Center for Tax Policy Administration at OECD, started to personify the arm's length principle, as like an athlete who needed to be strengthened, maybe steroids, I don't know, but instead of, faced with the threats that this is an ineffective thing and should be, gotten rid of, then the move towards personification started. And, having studied, religion, I'm like, wow, this is really interesting. So can you do something with that? And I just think your paper, Nick, is quite interesting about what U.S. states are doing. Any broader research of other states that you've done?
Are you taking several or?
No, go ahead.
Okay, well, that's quite something to hear. That athlete comparison, I think it also tells maybe something that if those people, they are like every day waking up and concentrating on this single phenomenon, then they might end up inventing that kind of metaphors. But yeah, I can only agree with what Taylor said in the beginning, and Raymond said that the metaphors and concepts we use, they really matter. So I think it would be good to point out that kind of situations that hey, there's something going on here, and that this metaphor you're using, it doesn't make any sense. Basically, I think I don't have anything more to say than that.
Perhaps to add on, like you mentioned, religious studies and studies of religion. So I used to work a little bit on I published stuff called like International Monetary Fund, Modern Priests in the 90s and stuff like that, where I tried to connect sort of some analysis of the economic that came from, let's say, Latin American liberation theology, and when they focus on dependency and capitalism, but also then, of course, fetishism of the commodity and all that gives you another sort of entry to their sort of religious-like nature in the use of myths and fetishes in justifying domination within the economic. And in some sense, we don't really go there, but the religious, I'm really glad you mentioned it, because that's one sort of way of grounding it more in analysis of ideology.
Tove writing from Eurodev. I think one aspect that could also be interesting to the point, I don't know if you touched on it, is communication and political strategy, including spin strategy. I think as much as I'm sure the OECD wants a smooth running machine and good guidelines, the timing of the BEPS project was very, very strategic in the sense that the questioning of the arm's length principle was growing. They jumped on it and got a 2-year holiday from the criticism because we are working on changing it, at which point they end by donating themselves a 5-year implementation period. And I suspect that the next many years, when we try to challenge these issues, we will be hearing give BEPS a chance. This is something the OECD has done before. They used to have a monopoly on business and human rights as well, under what was known as the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Principles. It also has a tax element in it. And the annoying thing was that we were not allowed to ask for more until we proved that the guidelines didn't work, which meant you had to submit a huge case to an OECD contact point that was the most Kafka process you could imagine. After 6 years, they got back to us and said that their case was outdated, and they had even spelled the name of the company we had complained about wrong in the decision. But you had to prove that it wasn't working, so we went through 6 years of this approving process, at which point they revised the guidelines. So you basically had to go all over again and submit your cases again to prove that the new guidelines were also not working. This was an exercise clearly focused on political stalling and communication. And I think BEPS has taken it to new levels because the media coverage of BEPS has been enormous, fantastic, and multinational, it's over. And it's really been fascinating to see the OECD operating like a very aggressive government.
Yeah, I can only comment that they've been doing this before, and referring to what I was saying in the last session, that actually the OECD's Code of Conduct on multinational companies, it was originally a reaction of the UN attempts to form a Code of Conduct on transnational companies. So it's this, there's been this kind of forum shifting, as it can be called, going on for a long time, and of course they are very clever in what they're doing. And I think that also stresses the significance of developing alternative concepts on how to call it, to see the phenomenon as it is, that it's whitewashing and so on.
Just a question for Nick. I'm wondering if in this research you had any conclusions around formulaic apportionment. Sorry for the second question on it, but it seems to me if BMW is going to South Carolina based on utility rates, then South Carolina should be apportioned some of the tax based on what they put in, the inputs. And that can be extended to education, perhaps,
Right.
training the workforce, other pieces of the formula.
Sure, and that's going to be actually a question that I thank you if you understand the process better. So BMW comes in, gets all these breaks, and they say, and now we're going to invest and build ICAR, the Center for Automatic Innovation and blah, 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 to Clemson University. Is that tax deductible? Again, so you come in, you get all these breaks to come in and expand, and of course, you also, and this is the thing that I have, to answer part of the first question, I modeled in another publication that I have, unemployment and foreign direct investment in the United States. It's an inverse relationship. FBI goes in and unemployment goes out. And so I've been beating that drum, and it's just like, it's not getting that much. And it's an entire literature on job change that says it's because the most desperate states are given the best incentive packages there to have inefficient labor markets. Because of high mobility, there's this job change that forms. So when an immigrant comes in and fills in a job that's created by this new foreign direct investment, has multiplier negative effect in the local job market. So the poorest of states are spiraling. That's why South Carolina has the highest unemployment rate. It's the #1 attractive foreign direct investment. So these are the kind of games that we play. Come on in, then we'll build ICAR, and then we'll build a park, and then we'll do something for the school, and then there's a clinic. But if we can get all of that operationalization of the new entity tax deductible, then I don't see the net benefit if it's eroding your tax base in the first place. So I've started the second project when we're modeling this relationship between FDI at the state level and unemployment with migration rates. So I'm just trying to get a reliable longitudinal metric of migration rates and see if that's the connectivity. So, I call it the working from the statistical supreme. So, it's similar.
Your additional questions, please. While you're thinking of that, let me make a comment, and please come up with your own questions. Let's be clear that on the issue of transfer pricing. Transfer pricing is a legitimate subject within multinational corporations. Multinational corporations, when they're trading between subsidiaries or between parents and subsidiaries, they have to figure out at what price they should trade, taking in consideration manufacturing costs and advertising, and overheads, and all sorts of things. It's a legitimate subject. It becomes abusive transfer pricing when you factor into that equation the manipulation of taxes. Customs duties, VAT taxes, income taxes, and so forth. This is in the law of the United States and other countries. The words abusive transfer pricing. So when people tell you transfer pricing is bad, no. Abusive transfer pricing is bad. And I repeat what I said in my own remarks. I've never known a corporation that didn't do it. It's done all the time. This is basically the work of tax planning departments, is to manipulate prices for the purpose of manipulating customs duties, VAT taxes, income taxes, and so forth. But we had a conference last year in which two people got into a tussle with each other over the term of transfer pricing. Perfectly legitimate subject. Becomes abusive transfer pricing when used to manipulate taxes. Now I've given you time to formulate your questions. What are your questions, please? Yeah.
You had a question or a comment relating to the extent to which you were exploring the idea of a firm being a political entity rather than a kind of private entity, because I do think that's very relevant to these debates. And I was thinking of some literature in political theory which looks at the analogy between firms and states. And some political theorists want to challenge this analogy. But I think you're rightly saying there are many ways in which firms are quite like states. We saw a slide earlier which showed that the GDPs of many companies are almost identical to the GDPs of some small countries. And so I suppose it's really a comment to see the extent to which you're trying to unpack the notion that the firm is a private entity, like, say, the family. And I like the analogy you drew with kind of feminist political theory, where you're actually saying something that you usually take to be part of this private realm, and being a good liberal upholding the public-private distinction, and so actually isn't. And so I guess it's really a question to find out a bit more about how your paper was unpacking and exploring and challenging the idea that a firm is a private entity.
Yeah, of course it can be private and political.
Sure.
But one thing is, when we say there's this planning element and all that, of course, people sometimes say, okay, but there's also market and there's competition, and fine, there is. One of our counter-arguments is states as entities also are have market pressure and competition. So you can't claim that our claim that it's a political entity is false by saying that they are in a sort of sea of competitive pressures in any ways. So we do play with that analogy, and I think we to some extent, I've sometimes argued that the main difference between the corporation and the state is not that one is political and one is not. It's that because one is territorially based and one is not. One is in theory based, its legitimacy is based on supposedly democratic values, and the other is not, and another. But the political economic dichotomy there doesn't function. The practical relevance there, we don't necessarily go into that so much here, but sometimes I've thought, like, what could we learn about so-called transitions to democracy in Eastern Europe or Latin America if we take the analogy and want to see transitions towards democratic enterprise? Just one minor thing with that analogy, that some researchers who might be criticized for a constructivist approach or something have said that actually, I guess, that often when the rulers, the dictators were saying we give only minor concessions, let them have a meeting in a church and talk about human rights, it doesn't really matter. We have things under control, and then you show that things started snowballing anyways. To what extent corporate responsibility talk could be conceptualized as an analogous concession? Yes, let's take one step out of the comfort zone of capitalist legitimacy, theory of economic neutrality, and accept social responsibility, which is halfway to accepting political responsibility, because we have it under control. We just blah, 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 and they will not be able to attack our power. To what extent are there possibilities that it could start snowballing and become a subversive doctrine? As Milton Friedman very correctly said, I defend the political theory argument here of Milton Friedman. I love doing that, because he said never start with corporate social responsibility, because it makes you accept that the corporate functionaries are like the taxmen, that they are like public servants, and thus they should be in a free society politically accountable. So never accept that. Now everybody's accepting. So we and Milton Friedman say, well, actually, if you accept corporate social responsibility doctrine, Milton Friedman and we say that then the next coherent step is to accept democratic accountability. Not just us, but Milton. We disagree on whether that would be desirable or not.
Yeah,
But I defend his political theory argument there. And that's also the analogy, which it's nice to play with that analogy, but
Yeah.
of course it's not perfect.
Yeah.
My question is because Table was talking about transition, I'm wondering whether, and Raymond was bringing up this question of abuse, because in some ways corporations already, they have to use manipulation, to get their profits up. But what if we go with this idea of abusive, transfer pricing? Have you seen that intensifying in transition areas more than other areas, when there is this corporate exchanges?
Well, I think that's something that Raymond is very very much on top of that question, that the illicit financial flows they have grown in the last 10 or 15 years quite dramatically. Of course, there are different estimates from different bodies and so on, but I think that's the consensus estimate at the moment. And actually, I wanted to comment also on the fact.
But in terms of transition countries, have you seen? I'm speaking about transition. Bulgaria, for instance, or where countries. Like right now, for instance, we're seeing China entering into Africa, forcefully. How? Is there anything going on there that in the last few years that has intensified this abusive transfer pricing?
I would actually let Raymond answer that. Just a very quick remark on that abusive transfer pricing. We also discussed these terms in our paper, and one alternative term we introduced is from 1970s from Ronald Muller and William Barnes from their books, and they talk about cross-subsidization, and I think that's also an interesting concept as an alternative to abusive transfer pricing, because it sort of draws attention that while states can subsidize different industries and companies can also subsidize some subsidiaries, but maybe you can answer the other question.
I talk at law schools occasionally. And what I love to do is to have the law students read a case that was decided by the Supreme Court called U.S. versus Pasquantino. Pasquantino was a criminal who was smuggling cigarettes and liquor from the United States into Canada. And the case, he was caught, and the case went to a lower court and worked its way up to the Supreme Court. And I have the law school students read this case because Pasquantino was judged guilty on the basis that he had indulged in a scheme to defraud. And what was extremely interesting about this case is that it didn't matter who was defrauded, in this case, Canada, a foreign government, or of what they were defrauded, in this case, customs duties. It was the fact that these people had gathered in the United States and used mails and wires for the purpose of conducting a scheme to defraud. That's against the law of the United States. Now, what's interesting about this case is that I bring into the classroom 4 students from the MBA school, and I give them a transfer pricing case. And I ask them to go outside and discuss this for 30 minutes and decide on the price at which the subsidiary should sell this to the parent. Your one job is to maximize profits for the corporation. Okay, that's your job, maximize profits for the corporation. So the MBA students go out, 2 of them representing the parent, and 2 of them representing the subsidiary, and they inevitably decide on a price that manipulates customs duties and VAT taxes and income taxes and so forth. So I asked them to come back into class, and the 4 of them sit here and discuss how they decided on the price, and the law students are listening. And then I pass out to the law school students a letter, ostensibly from one of the 4 people, the business people who were making this decision. And the letter says, I'm vaguely aware of anti-money laundering legislation and tax evasion and all that sort of stuff, and I'm just uncomfortable with having participated in this decision to manipulate the taxes of another country through this process. I'd like you to give me a 1-sentence letter. No lawyer ever gives a 1-sentence letter. But I'd like you to give me a 1-sentence letter that says the chance that I have committed a felony offense is 0, or, second possibility, there is a chance that I have committed a felony offense by indulging in this exercise of manipulating the prices for the purpose of manipulating taxes in other countries. Last time I did that, 19 out of 23 law school students said there's a chance you committed a felony offense. Think of that. Corporations are doing this every day of the world, thousands, tens of thousands of transactions. Is there a possibility that they're committing a felony offense? I wish we could take that further. We have not been able to get past Latino to go further into the corporate thinking, but we'd love to be able to do that sometime. More questions, please.
To follow up on that, are those MBA students taking any of that with them as they leave their MBA programs?
I'm looking into that question right now. When I got an MBA, I had no education whatsoever on transfer pricing, manipulation of taxes in other countries and so forth. Now it is absolutely normalized. So what we are looking at is curriculum of graduate school programs to see whether or not we can find courses that are taught. What's the impact of this? I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know whether MBA students today come out of school with the knowledge of how to do this, or whether they pick it up when they get to work for the corporation. But we would like to be able to answer that question. We've got 3 more minutes. Is that right?
I think I can offer an example.
Please do.
Can I offer an example of transitional countries and transfer pricing? Just watched a documentary. I have a project out on fast fashion, reverse incentives, and fast fashion economics. So I just watched a documentary on how H&M structured their global supply chains to avoid taxes, transfer pricing, being discussed in that. So apparently, in the transitional countries, they were using Bangladesh and Ethiopia. Through a subsidiary that places orders as independent suppliers, the garments, partially manufactured or fully manufactured, and then shipped to the corporate offices in usually in the West, but it's usually in Sweden. So if the garment is manufactured here, but there's no acceptance of delivery for retail purposes, the transaction is not taxed. So that was explained in the operations in Ethiopia as the place where they were expanding the most. And the one statistic they offered is the owner of those subsidiaries was the 67th wealthiest man on earth, Sheikh Ali somebody or other. But then the transfer pricing was actually happening in the retail outlets where H&M had a store. So where normally the parent entity in Stockholm will sell the shirt for €5, and then the retail outlet will do the retailing to sell it for $7. That $2 in whatever entity is up to be taxed at the local government level. If you put extra fees on that $2 to diminish, then local tax cannot be collected because those are transfer pricing fees. So those are marketing fees, administrative fees, promotional fees, whatever. So there's this game then at the retail level to shrink that profit margin so the actual retailer outfits internationally do not show profit. And I fought for a documentary intended for general audiences. They explained it pretty well. So Google The World According to H&M. It's done by French National Television, and it's fantastic.
Any final questions? I'd like you to join me in giving another round of applause. I believe it is now lunchtime.